Good afternoon. Today I will tell you about American history in the 1950s. Chapter 1. A New Beginning, Post-War Hope and the American Dream. The 1950s began not just as a new decade, but as a new chapter in American life. After the horrors of World War II, Americans were hungry for peace, stability, and prosperity. Over 16 million Americans had served in the military. Many had seen death, destruction, and hardship across Europe and the Pacific. When they came home, they didn't want more war. They wanted to build. And so they did. With the help of the GI Bill, millions of veterans went to college, bought homes, started businesses, and began families. Cities swelled, but it was the suburbs that symbolized the American dream. White picket fences, well-kept lawns, and the promise of a better future. The nation was optimistic, and baby cries filled the air in what came to be known as the baby boom. Behind this dream, however, was a growing tension. Not everyone had equal access to this prosperity. Women, who had taken on industrial jobs during the war, were pushed back into domestic roles. People of color, particularly African Americans, were left out of the benefits of the GI Bill due to systemic racism. But on the surface, America looked unstoppable. A new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, promised to lead with calm strength, and millions tuned into their new black and white televisions to watch the future unfold, one broadcast at a time. Chapter 2. Cold War Shadows, Fear, Loyalty, and the Red Scare. While Americans were buying homes and watching TV shows, a storm was brewing, not overseas, but in the minds and hearts of the people. The Cold War wasn't a battle of guns and tanks. It was a war of nerves, of ideologies, and of fear. After 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, Americans felt that fear in their bones. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills under their desks, believing it might save them from a nuclear explosion. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The possibility of instant, fiery death hung like a cloud over an otherwise bright decade. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was the first real clash of the Cold War. Thousands of young Americans died in a country they had barely heard of, fighting to keep communism from spreading. It ended in a stalemate, a painful, unresolved reminder that the Cold War could turn deadly at any moment. At home, Americans turned on each other in paranoia. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused government officials, actors, writers, and everyday people of being communists. Lives were ruined by suspicion. Careers were lost. Families were torn apart. The fear wasn't just of foreign enemies anymore. It was of neighbors, friends, co-workers. This was the Red Scare, and it scarred a generation. Chapter 3. Life in Technicolor, Suburbia, Cars, and the Rise of Comfort. If the 1930s were marked by depression and the 1940s by war, the 1950s were the era of comfort, or at least the image of it. Everything was new. New houses, new cars, new gadgets, and a new way of life. Suburban neighborhoods grew seemingly overnight. In places like Levittown, thousands of nearly identical houses appeared in perfect rows, offering the middle class a place to settle down, away from the noise and grit of the cities. The car became king. America built the interstate highway system, and with it came motels, roadside diners, and drive-in theaters. Families took road trips. Teenagers drove to dances. The open road was freedom. And at the heart of it all was television. Shows like I Love Lucy and Father Knows Best painted a picture of the perfect family. A smiling dad in a suit, a loving mother in the kitchen, and children with good manners and clean clothes. It was an idealized vision, comforting to some, but alienating to others who didn't or couldn't fit in. Behind this gloss was a growing divide. Women, often told to be happy housewives, felt stifled and invisible. Minorities were rarely seen on TV unless in stereotypical roles. Beneath the neatness of Suburbia, tensions were quietly building, ready to boil over. Chapter 4. Seeds of Change, the Civil Rights Movement Awakens. For African Americans, the 1950s were not a time of comfort. They were a time of courage. While others were celebrating the American dream, Black Americans were still being denied the most basic human rights. Segregation was the law in the South. Black children were sent to separate schools, often run down and underfunded. Black families couldn't eat in white-only diners. use the same water fountains, or sit where they wanted on the bus. But something began to shift. In 1954, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. The decision was a lightning bolt. White segregationists resisted. Black communities felt hope and the courage to act. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, a quiet, dignified seamstress, refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus. Her arrest lit a fire. The Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., lasted over a year. People walked to work, to church, to school. They endured threats and violence. But they won. The buses were desegregated. It was more than a legal victory. It was a spiritual one. The 1950s saw the beginning of a movement, nonviolent, powerful, unstoppable, that would demand that America live up to its promises of liberty and justice for all. Chapter 5. Sound and Soul, Rock and Roll, Teenagers, and American Culture. Something electric was happening to the culture of America in the 1950s. It started with a beat, a rhythm that couldn't be stopped. Rock and roll exploded onto the scene. It wasn't just music, it was rebellion. It came from deep roots in African American blues and gospel. Artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and later Elvis Presley brought it to the mainstream. Their songs made teenagers scream, dance, and, to their parents' horror, question authority. Teenagers, now with money to spend and time to spare, became a new cultural force. They had their own clothes, language, hangouts, and dreams. They read comic books, went to sock hops, and fell in love in the backseats of cars at drive-ins. For many, it was a golden age of innocence, but culture was also beginning to crack. Writers like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, part of the Beat generation, rejected conformity and materialism. They wrote about pain, loneliness, and the search for meaning. Even as TV showed the world in black and white, the real world was becoming more complicated, colorful, and chaotic. Chapter 6. Race to the Stars, Science, Fear, and the Future. On October 4th, 1957, a beep echoed from the skies. It came from Sputnik, the first man-made satellite, launched by the Soviet Union. Americans were stunned. This tiny object, no bigger than a beach ball, symbolized something terrifying. The Soviets were ahead. If they could launch a satellite, could they launch a nuclear missile? The space race had begun, not just for science, but for survival. The U.S. scrambled to respond. Schools shifted focus toward math and science. Congress created NASA in 1958. Children dreamed of being astronauts. Scientists worked day and night. The future was no longer just a dream. It was a competition. Meanwhile, in hospitals, a quieter miracle happened. In 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk developed a polio vaccine, saving countless lives and ending a terrifying disease that had crippled thousands of children each year. Technology was changing everything, not just how people lived, but what they believed was possible. The 1950s ended not with a conclusion, but with a question: what comes next? More history on my channel, A Piece of History.